Thank you very much, Isabella, for that very kind introduction. And I'd like to say a big thank you to the Vasili School of International Affairs for hosting this presentation, and also a big thank you to my great friend and colleague, Professor David Welsh, who unfortunately can't be with him here in person. He's not well at the moment, but I believe he's joining us online. So a big thank you to David. Quite an ambitious presentation this morning, and I'm going to try and talk for about 40 minutes because I want to allow plenty of time for Q&A if possible. And essentially, I'm going to talk about, as the working title says, 9/11 and the emerging global order. And let me just give you an overview of the sort of things we're going to cover. First of all, I'm going to give you sort of grand view of the presentation, if that's the right way of putting it. I talk briefly about the circumstances, it will be brief, that led to 9/11, because I think the Bush administration always claimed it was a transformative event that came out of the clear blue sky. That's not true. It's we're talking about consequences of something. We must be clear about the circumstances in which the event occurred. I want to talk briefly about America's response to 9/11 and some of the trends that have emerged as a result of America's hyper-military response to the events of 9/11. Then I'm going to talk about what does this mean for the international system. We're obviously seeing, and it's alarming, and all of us in this room are aware of it, growing intensification of geopolitics and great power rivalry. And that leads some people to conclude that we're facing a new Cold War. I disagree with that, because there's another part of the international scene that's often neglected, and that is that we're having a proliferation of problems which do not respect boundaries and cannot be fixed unilaterally by superpowers. And that trend is increasing rather than weakening. So we have a curious juxtaposition, fragmentation, but also forces which can only be solved by self-interested international cooperation. I want to probe this a little bit more and say, what are the downstream effects of this odd coexistence between integrating forces and disintegrating forces? And one possibility that I want to talk about is the emergence of a post-hegemonic global order. And that's a concluding remark. So that's our agenda for this morning. So, my overview. Since the late 1980s, the world has entered a turbulent and prolonged transition to a new international order. 9/11 was always a symptom rather than a cause of systemic change in world politics. Having said that, it must be acknowledged that the massive, and I would argue largely unsuccessful military responses of the George W. Bush administration and its successors, 3 successive administrations, to the nature of America's response to the 9/11 attack have had significant consequences in shaping the world we live in today. And I think today, nearly a quarter of a century on, is a good time to take stock. The post-9/11 world has been marked by the erosion of the international rules-based order. And here I make a distinction between what America sees as the US rules-based order and what middle powers and small countries regard, particularly liberal democracies, most of whom depend on it, on a vision of international relations based on principles and institutions. We've also seen not only the decline of the international rules-based order, but we've seen the intensification, as I've said before, of geopolitics. We've seen the steady proliferation of transboundary challenges that defy unilateral solutions. The trajectory of change, I will argue, is towards, and it will take several decades, a post-hegemonic world in which small and middle powers play a larger international role to that which they've been accustomed to in international affairs. But the journey to that destination is an uncertain one and a complex one. So let me just spend no more than 3 minutes on the circumstances that led to 9/11. The end of the Cold War and what might be described as thickening globalization, I'll define that term shortly, brought radical changes in the global security environment by the early 90s. The US, of course, was left as the sole superpower in a post-Cold War world that was experiencing the impact of globalization. Globalization was a process that actually began, as I understood it, in the early 80s with the development of the microchip. The term globalization, which was popularized in the 80s, could be broadly defined as the intensification of technologically driven links between societies, institutions, cultures, and individuals on a worldwide basis. Said these technological changes have made the world seem a much smaller place for many of us. Initially, the administrations of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were optimistic about America navigating its new foreign policy in a post-Cold War world. You can understand their optimism. They were left standing at the end of the Cold War, and there was a feeling that the United States, in Mr. Bush's senior's words, had won the Cold War. What we can see in the initial attempts to define US foreign policy, Mr. Bush spoke about a new world order. Mr. Clinton preferred the term assertive multilateralism. That terminology, however, soon petered out as the 1990s wore on. We can see elements, those of you interested in international relations theory, in these initial formulations of the New World Order and assertive multilateralism. You can see elements of liberalism, realism, and social constructivism. But I don't think New Zealand's can't break habits easy. United States unipolar moment. I don't think New Zealand's ever had a unipolar moment, but the US certainly did. And I think the unipolar moment did not last as long as many commentators have suggested it had. There was the disastrous US-UN humanitarian intervention in Somalia, which led to the Battle of Mogadishu in October 1993. And after that traumatic event, there was a fixation in Washington of not crossing the Mogadishu line and allowing engagement in intrastate conflict slide into sort of nation building, carrying the possible risk of US casualties. This term I've, in a previous publication, called the Somalia syndrome. The reluctance to risk US forces in situations were not seen directly relevant to the national interests of the United States. Presidential Decision Directive 25 codified a clear retreat towards a selective approach to engagement when regarding matters of international security. PDD 25, amongst other things, said that failed states were not a threat to the United States. You cannot understand America's reluctance to get involved in Rwanda or Haiti or a number of other hotspots in the 90s without taking into account what was the traumatic experience for America in Somalia. The problem was that while the United States reverted back to almost a traditional understanding, sort of national security realism, if you like, after Somalia, the security environment was changing rapidly. Somalia wasn't a one-off. It was actually representative of the new security environment that was emerging. And in short, America's response to Somalia tended to impede its understanding to events that would eventually make the shocking events of 9/11 possible. Between 1992 and 2000, American personnel and interests were on the receiving end of violent attacks from Al-Qaeda or its associates. Al-Qaeda was involved in a low-level way in the Battle of Mogadishu, as Bill Clinton subsequently acknowledged in 1998. But Al-Qaeda started gunning. One of the lessons that Al-Qaeda derived from America's decision to cut and run after the Battle of Mogadishu was that America lacked political will to use its undoubted power to subdue adversaries. That was probably a misjudgment on the part of Al-Qaeda, but what it did do was fuel a series of terrorist attacks on the United States in the 1990s, culminating in the worst ever attack for 9/11 on a US naval vessel in Aden, which killed 17 American personnel and something like $250 million worth of damage to the US warship that was being refueled in Aden. I think it's very important to set the scene in this way so that we can understand carefully why the American response to 9/11 didn't sit comfortably with the international environment that was unfolding in the 21st century. I'm not going to rehash the events of 9/11, we're very much aware of them. But I think what we can establish is that the Bush administration's response resulted in two wars, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, and led to the US in being embroiled in major conflicts. And that was quite expensive. The Obama administration did change the language around counterterrorism. It abandoned the term war on terror, and it targeted Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan rather than Iraq. But although it's removed about a third of the leadership, either through detention or killing, killed some of bin Laden, of course, was killed in Pakistan in 2011, May 2011. Nevertheless, the Obama administration struggled in a number of ways in terms of its security policy. Its multilateralist tilt caused problems for the Obama administration with respect to the Syrian civil war. Also, to some degree, the Obama administration had to deal with the downstream consequence of the Iraq invasion, which was the emergence of the Islamic State. And another downstream consequence of the US invasion of Iraq was, of course, the inflation of Iran, which Brent Scowcroft, the former national security advisor to Mr. Bush Sr., had warned in a prophetic article which was published in the Wall Street Journal in 2002. That was precisely what he predicted would happen, that Iran's regional role would increase through American invasion of Iraq. And in addition, despite making an early pledge to make a breakthrough in Israeli-Palestinian tensions, I think the first phone call Mr. Obama placed as president was to Mahmoud Abbas. He didn't follow up, but that lost momentum, and we can discuss why if you wish later on. What about the Trump administration? Trump administration, determined to bring an end to what he called America's endless wars, signed a deal with the Taliban in February 2020 for the complete withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan by May 21. Mr. Trump also placed a travel ban on terror-prone Muslim, as he saw it, terror-prone Muslim majority states as part of a drive against what he called radical Islamic terrorism. And the Trump administration recognized Jerusalem as the new capital of Israel, which was quite divisive internationally. What about the Biden administration? To its credit, the Biden administration became the first US administration in the post 9/11 period to recognize that violent white supremacists within America constituted a threat that was comparable to that presented by Islamist terrorism internationally. Nevertheless, the Biden administration, as many of us in the room are aware, was rocked by the speed of the Taliban victory and the chaotic nature of the American exit from Afghanistan in September 2021. More recently, the Biden administration seems to be unaware that a stance of unwavering support for the Netanyahu's government's policy, and it's Mr. Netanyahu's words, not mine, mighty vengeance in Gaza following Hamas's horrific terror attacks in Israel on the 7th of October 2023. The Biden administration seems to be almost unaware that almost unconditional support for that Israeli relentless military bombardment of Gaza would provide a strategic windfall for Islamist terrorist organizations in the region, and also bolster authoritarian geopolitical rivals like Russia, like China, and Iran. In short, the Biden administration has also been grappling with the downstream consequences of the world and its rearrangement after 9/11. So let me just reflect on that very sketchy overview of potted history of a four American administration response to 9/11. During the last 24 years, the United States has managed to prevent a repetition of the devastating 9/11 terrorist attacks, a fact that was stressed by a whole succession of American academics and commentators on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. But all four administrations have more or less persisted with a military-centered counterterrorism approach, fueled by, again, more or less, a sense of US exceptionalism, i.e. the conviction that the US has a special destiny among nations. And also, at least from non-American eyes, one can detect the burgeoning influence of the military-industrial complex in the United States, to use Dwight Eisenhower's phrase. If you haven't read it, I would certainly recommend reading Dwight Eisenhower's solemn warning to future presidents of the United States in 1961, when he warned about what he saw as the dangerous influence of the military-industrial complex on a democracy like the United States. Altogether, the United States, since 9/11, has spent in excess of $8 trillion on post-9/11 security concerns. But despite all that expenditure, the threat of transnational terrorism has not diminished. In fact, if anything, it has regrouped. The many terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda have expanded, but they're not targeting what they call the far enemy. They're now concentrating on the near enemy. That is to say, Al-Qaeda now has more than 30,000 members, as opposed to the 3,000 it had in September 2001. We've also seen the emergence of Islamic State. Again, it was physically destroyed to some degree during 2017, 2018, but it remains a potent force on the internet and still has the ability, as we've seen, to attract and win support from sort of, if you like, lone wolf actors via the internet. In short, it maintains a sophisticated social media operation, which is capable of causing great damage. And we've also seen, as the Biden administration acknowledged, not only the emergence of violent white extremism in the United States, but its export. My country, New Zealand, was the subject of its own 9/11, so to speak, in March, 15th of March, 2019, 51 New Zealand Muslim citizens were killed by a white supremacist who happened to be Australian, whose manifesto included the praise for Mr. Trump and also the alt-right movement. So this is not just a problem for the United States, it's a global problem. At the same time, the Washington's response to 9/11 has played a role, I would argue, in accelerating adverse trends at the state level. And I think to some extent, this response of America has to some extent interrupted the process in which a superpower should adjust to the international environment which it faces. Let me expand on that. I think we can, and I will develop these points in the last part of the presentation. As we reflect 24 years on, I think it's possible to identify 4 major trends that have flowed. And I'm talking about international trends here. First, the 9/11 era has been marked by a clear erosion of international relations based on a vision of rules and principles and institutions. The US's illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003, China's illegal assertiveness in the South China Sea, and Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea and subsequent full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 were all cases in point. Second, the post-9/11 environment has witnessed a relative decline in US global standing. And we must distinguish here between US power, which in my view is unrivaled, and its standing, where it stands, how it's seen through the eyes of other countries. A combination of military overstretch, fighting 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, America's astoundingly high debt levels, and the emergence of authoritarian China as a second superpower, has all these factors have to some extent diminished America's dominance compared with its position in the early 90s in the post-9/11 period. Third, China's rise has coincided with the intensification of geopolitical rivalry with the United States, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. Concerns about China's stance towards Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the Pacific Island nations, the Biden administration in particular has strengthened multilateral arrangements like the Quad and announced in September 2021 formation of AUKUS. I know that organisation is of some interest, or has been some interest to the Canadian government, and is certainly of some interest to the New Zealand government. AUKUS is an enhanced security partnership which aims to bolster this is what it aims to do, in theory, aims to bolster the international rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region by deterring China. China is the target of AUKUS. Fourth, the post-9/11 global environment has been characterized by a steady proliferation of transboundary issues which are too big for even superpowers to fix. Climate change, global pandemics, transnational terrorism. The US did have a stab at trying to fix that unilaterally under Mr. Bush, but it didn't work out very well. And of course, problems like financial contagion present challenges without passports that cannot be resolved without international cooperation. In short, these 4 trends point to a world which is characterized by both signs of alarm and also indications of hope. And probably the alarm at the moment, the alarming signs outweigh the hopeful developments. So what do these trends mean for the evolution of the international system? Will the forces of geopolitical competition and fragmentation prevail over the imperatives of international cooperation and integration? or will the reverse occur? I will argue, sorry, I've gone through that, so I won't dwell on it. I will argue that the emergence of a post-hegemonic order is indeed on the agenda in the decades ahead. It's linked to the relative decline of the United States, to what I have inelegantly phrased the non-hegemonic rise of China. That's in no way an apologist term for China or its authoritarian system. And also the acceleration of globalization at a time of pressing transboundary issues that are getting little attention from the major geopolitical contenders. As I said before, America, jet lag does take its toll. America remains the most powerful state in the world, but this reality should not mask its relative decline in terms of its position and how it's seen in the world. This decline derives from changes in the international arena, that is, factors beyond America's control. Factors which America cannot control. Transboundary issues. That is beyond America's control. It cannot unilaterally fix climate change. Whatever Mr. Trump says, or what any other Mr. President says, that is just objectively not possible. So, in short, these factors diminish the role of a superpower in the international system. And it's also quite novel for great powers to be confronted with an array of factors which essentially reduce the autonomy of a great power. And then, of course, other factors are what might be described as self-inflicted difficulties that have included a US disdain or inability to empathise with those directly affected by the sometimes unilateral actions of the United States. As one American commentator in the New Yorker put it not so recently, America is much of the time its own worst enemy. That's how it's seen outside the United States to some degree, when it matters of policy in the Middle East to some degree. If 9/11 revealed anything, it was that extraordinary national power. America was arguably, when 9/11 occurred, the most powerful state in human history. But that national power could not guarantee security in an increasingly interconnected world where relatively weak actors like Al-Qaeda can inflict devastating damage on the very symbols of American power, like the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. America, it wasn't American weakness that led to 9/11. It was the changes in the international environment that had gathered momentum from the early 90s. Measures of military spending, which of course have been risen dramatically in the post 9/11 period, are not the same as measures of military capacity. 9/11 showed how a modest investment by terrorists could cause significant levels of human and physical destruction. And 9/11 also confirmed that the process of globalization was not owned by the United States. There had been an assumption in some quarters in the early, certainly in my country, in New Zealand, many people believed that globalization was synonymous with Americanization. I think globalization genie is well and truly out of the bottle, as Al-Qaeda used all the potentialities of globalization to good effect, to devastating effect on 9/11. So let me talk a little bit more depth and round things off by some of these trends that may be propelling the world to a new international order. I mentioned three factors, and first of them is the relative decline of the United States. I know I mentioned this, but I want to focus on this a little bit more depth to make the case that we are heading for systemic change. The counterterrorism policies of four administrations have undermined Washington's commitment to a liberal order which it largely played when it was a key architect in creating in the post-45 period. And unfortunately, this undermining by the United States, to some degree, we often think of China and Russia, quite rightly, as undermining international rules based, but the United States has also played a part in there. And it's unfortunate because it's occurred at a time when actors like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, white supremacists, extremists, and now populist radical right actors and their supporters champion all forms of particularism, rejection of universal norms, and preach hatred of the other. We've seen a lot of that, haven't we, in elections, not just in the United States, but a number of other liberal democracies in the last few years. Moreover, there's little evidence in the post-9/11 era that the US administrations have shown the capacity to learn from the experiences the United States has undergone during the post-9/11 period. Ben Rhodes has referred to this as America's failure to correct policies which are not working. Again, we can take that up in the Q&A session. I think two factors are responsible for America's inability to adjust policies which are not working. One is a combination of US exceptionalism. The view right across the political aisle in the United States, repeated by the likes of Biden and Mr. Trump, is that America remains the greatest democracy on the planet. And you may say that's just campaign rhetoric, but it's not words that are uttered in other democracies. And then, of course, there's the fact we've already mentioned, a burgeoning military-industrial complex. If you've got a very large hammer in your hand, there is a tendency to see problems, every problem, as a nail that should be struck on the head. There's been Mr. Obama, in his gave a very good interview just before he left office, in which he said that there's been a tendency in the United States to overuse and over-exaggerate the utility of military force. And I think the post-9/11 period has continued to demonstrate that. But the point I'm anxious to make today to you is, despite America's relative decline, it's far from clear that another state will displace the United States as the world's leading power in the 21st century. Let's consider what I've called the non-hegemonic rise of China. I've deliberately called it the non-hegemonic rise because many commentators and analysts are continually saying China is poised to displace the United States as the #1 power and effectively run the world, as if the world can be run by superpowers. I think a lot of this thinking, of course, derives from, if you like, the past. And the past is their only frame of reference, so it's quite a reasonable deduction to make. Paul Kennedy, who wrote that brilliant book called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, said the international standing of a great power depends on a delicate balance between its military expenditure and its economic performance. Historically, he argued, no great power had managed to exercise its dominance permanently, and Kennedy argued there was no reason to believe the 21st century would change that pattern. And a number of commentators, Niall Ferguson being one of the most recent, I'm sure many of you saw his article of How America Can Win the New Cold War with China, subscribe to this view that the two most powerful countries in the world are on a collision course. The assumption here, of course, the key assumption here, seems to be the future of the world. Indeed, the fate of the world will be determined by a great power contest involving the United States and China. My counter argument to that is, what about the rest? The rest of the world. China is an authoritarian state and dictatorship. We should have no illusions about that whatsoever. And it's ambitious, as any country which has experienced its historical rise in economic power would be. But we should not exaggerate China's clout globally. China's rise to superpower status in 2006 has been built on an outstanding trade performance in the global capitalist economy. And Beijing's one-party state remains heavily dependent on Western export markets, too heavily dependent on Western export markets to be a truly revisionist, or as Lloyd Austin put it, the US Defense Secretary, a systemic threat to the United States and liberal democracies. Let me give you some figures. In 2023, the EU, US, Hong Kong, and Japan constituted the top 4 export markets for China. China has certainly and was certainly emboldened by the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. But please note, it certainly did not seek to upturn the global market system in 2008, 2009, when it was on its knees. In fact, it cooperated with the Obama administration in particular in trying to stabilize the situation. Why? Because China has an enormous stake. It's done very nicely, thank you, out of the global market system. It's a status quo power in that sense. The limitations of China's position in relation to the US also need to be spelled out. Unlike China, the US remains a heavyweight in military, economic, and political cultural terms. In short, although the US has experienced political ebbs and flows, and I think it's facing particular difficulties, like many of these people, I should imagine many people in this room, in the next few months. Nevertheless, we should not be blind to the fact that America has tremendous ideological power in the world. And unlike the authoritarian states, many people want to live in the United States. No one's queuing up, as far as I can see, to reproduce the one-party state system of China or Mr. Putin, which is effectively a one-party state. The other thing to keep in short, China lacks the sort of soft power that you need to be a global hegemon. China may have a fifth of the world's population, but as Brandy Womack points out, it has a fifth of the world's problems. So the end is on sight. So thank you for being so patient. We'll talk about the prospect of a post-hegemonic world, and that's the note I'm going to finish on. I've presented, in this presentation, I've presented some contradictory trends and trends of fragmentation, but also trends in which the number of transboundary issues are proliferating and which cannot be solved without international cooperation. I think on balance, that the trends towards cooperation will, over time, gather momentum. I think the problem with Paul Kennedy's perspective is that it ultimately fails to recognize that the current structure of the post-Cold War international system is fundamentally different from the past, and that the old pattern concerning the rise and fall of great powers no longer applies in the same fashion. America's relative decline does not mean the mantle of global leadership will be automatically passed from Washington to Beijing or another rising power in the future. China has become more important in the 21st century, but it's unlikely to become the new hegemon. The post-9/11 era has been characterized by the absence of global leadership on a whole range of things. Climate change, COVID-19. Now that was a wonderful opportunity for a global hegemon to rally the world against something which didn't recognize border. What happened? China and the United States exchanged accusations and blamed each other for a crisis which neither could control. There was an absence of global leadership during COVID-19. Great powers aided and abetted by a dysfunctional UN Security Council that enables 5 permanent members to use and abuse their power of veto, can act unilaterally. We've seen this during the Gaza crisis, where the United States has used the veto 4 times to prevent what the majority of the members of the United Nations want, which was an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. So they can, the United States can have disproportionate influence in that sense. But the results of such actions have been unimpressive and counterproductive. The United States can block what others are proposing when it comes to a ceasefire, but they can't impose their own ceasefire on the terms they want. So we're falling between two stools. We have the capacity with a dysfunctional UN Security Council to block international solutions to problems that need international solutions. But the actors doing the blocking can't actually impose their own solution. Globalization creates possibilities and constraints for all states in the international arena, in my view. And there's little evidence. There's been much talk about decoupling and deglobalization in the 21st century. There's little evidence that globalization is losing momentum. COVID-19 turbocharged virtual networks in everything from healthcare to business. And now we're seeing the advent of artificial intelligence, which is both a product and a cause of intensifying globalization. In short, the superpowers, the United States and China, face tough choices in the not too distant future. They can persevere with the vain quest for global hegemony, but they will do so at the risk of marginalizing themselves on some of the most serious issues facing people around the world: climate change, terrorism, energy, security, pandemics, financial contagions. These challenges that we face, that do not recognize boundaries, require international responses. And in many cases, institutions that can coordinate and implement such responses. Such international solutions will be very difficult to achieve, but the consequences of failing to do so will be much worse. As Edmund Burke once said about politics, and you can imply it in an international sphere, it's often a choice between the disagreeable and the intolerable. And we are at that reflective point, I think. In the post-9/11 era, the US has failed to provide the sort of multilateral leadership which could unlock solutions to many of these problems. But, to be fair, China, Russia, or India, they failed to provide such leadership as well. In terms of international relations theory, many decision makers in these states, in the major states, have relied on conceptual frameworks that seem to be at odds with the realities of a complex and increasingly interconnected world. For example, in the United States, foreign policy seems to be predominantly influenced by what would be called, what Mr. Bush used to call national security realism, and what a sort of social constructive variation of exceptionalism or unilateralism. These tendencies of national security realism and US exceptionalism seem to have played a disproportionate role in the post-9/11 period. So let me conclude and finish. We are beginning to see countries, middle powers, move into the void in global leadership. I found it very interesting that Turkey recently said, even before it played a key role in the overthrow of the Assad regime, it would not tolerate, this is Mr. President Erdogan's phrase, would not tolerate, or would not accept, I think is probably the phrase he actually used, but it was a very strong statement, any solution in Ukraine that did not restore the full territorial integrity of Ukraine, which was a bit of a warning to the incoming Trump administration. If you're looking for a land for peace deal in Ukraine, Turkey, for one, won't necessarily go along with them. It was an interesting development that Turkey, South Africa, particularly during the Gaza crisis, using the machinery of the International Court of Justice, these are showing possibilities where countries are beginning to realise they cannot always rely on great powers to solve their problems. So let me just summarise what I've said and hand over to Q&A. In this presentation, I have argued that 9/11 has served as something of a catalyst for propelling a transition towards a post-hegemonic order. This is not because today's superpowers are weaker than their counterparts. In fact, the US and China have enormous concentrations of national power at their disposal. But today's superpowers find themselves in an international environment in which many of the key challenges facing them do not respect borders and are too big for superpowers to fix. Superpowers are understandably reluctant to acknowledge it. But the willingness of middle and small power to assume greater collective responsibility may act as a stimulus for change. Thank you very much for your attention.